Senator Dirksen, Mr. Chief Justice, Mr. Vice President, President Johnson, Vice President Humphrey, my fellow Americans, and my fellow citizens of the world community. I ask you to share with me today the majesty of this moment. In the orderly transfer of power, we celebrate the unity that keeps us free. Each moment in history is a fleeting time, precious and unique. But some stand out as moments of beginning, in which courses are set that shape decades or centuries. This can be such a moment.
Welcome to American History Gazette. I'm Jake Suggs, and today we are joined by Luke Nichter. Luke is a professor of history and James Cavanaugh Endowed Chair in Presidential Studies at Chapman University. He is a New York Times best-selling author and editor for 8 books, including The Year That Broke Politics, Collusion and Chaos in the Presidential Election of 1968. Luke, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
Now, your book is a masterfully written book that offered a lot of insight into the American history and politics of the 60s, especially the 68 election. And the depth of your research is quite evident. You left no stone unturned. It was very thorough. But I'm curious as to what sparked your interest and your passion for presidential studies and the political landscape of the 60s in particular, and what inspired you to write this book.
Well, I wish I could tell you I had a brilliant answer ready for you, but I really don't. And I'm not afraid to say when I really don't know, and I'm also not afraid just to tell you what I really think most of the time. You know, I grew up probably you describe it as a blue-collar kid or lower middle class in Northwest Ohio, first-generation college graduate in my family. There's nothing about my background that suggests writing about the presidency or presidents or this time period. Also, some people write about a time period because they lived through it or want to make sense of it. I was born after this time period. I was born in the late 70s. And I always say, I think that gives me a disadvantage, but also an advantage. I'm really writing for my generation and younger. And for that generation, there's a lot of names and a lot of subjects that I have to learn. I've had to do a lot of reading to get the lay of the land of the 1960s, because a lot of these names are not intrinsic. I didn't grow up with them. I think for me, it was really in grad school when my interest in history came alive. I think there's something about when you're a young person and you begin to pay taxes and you have to get a job and you have to figure out how to pay off student loans, that you want to know more of how government works. And part of that is, how did we get to this point? And I think finally, the 1960s, when I was in grad school, what's usually 30 to 50 years old to everybody else is brand new to historians, because that's usually about how long it takes for records to be declassified by the government. And I was simply looking for an interesting topic for a doctoral thesis. I hope to graduate. I hope to pay off those student loans and get a job someplace. And for me, what was brand new back then was the 1960s. Still, a lot of records are being released today, but this was back 2004, 5, 6, almost 20 years ago now, when I was kind of in my mid-20s. And the 60s was really cutting edge and brand new. And I found it so interesting that I haven't wanted to leave the 1960s so far, because I think the history, I think, is really just becoming better written by people who are not seared by the passions of that time. I think the history of the 1970s really hasn't been written yet. And so eventually I'll probably exhaust my good ideas for the 60s and move on. But for the time being, I'm learning a lot and having fun.
No, that's awesome. It's no doubt that the 60s were one of the most chaotic and turbulent decades in American history. And that all kind of came to a climax in the 1968 presidential election. Obviously, we have the assassination of JFK in 63. But what was the context of the political landscape leading up to the 68 election?
Well, it was a chaotic time period. I suppose a bit like today, you had a lot of people back then sort of saying, the sky is falling. I think all presidents govern during some kind of a crisis, but there was something special that resonates to today from back then. in terms of you can check almost all the boxes: a political crisis, an economic crisis, a social or cultural crisis, a military or foreign policy crisis. At the time, the U.S. was stuck with no way out in what was then its longest war, with 500,000 troops deployed in Southeast Asia. You had just all the cultural and social upheaval of the 1960s. Part of that was the war because of the military draft. But young people, the younger generation, really being pitted against their parents and the older generation. Our college campuses were hotbeds of activism. Perhaps that hasn't changed. I think in all the 20th century, I would say probably the 1920s, 1960s, really just something fascinating culturally and socially going on. And so I have no shortage of subjects to write about in a book like this.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially 1968. It was one of the most turbulent years in American history. MLK was assassinated in April. RFK Jr., when he was running for president, the brother of JFK, was assassinated in June. And LBJ was president, but why was 1968 one of the most turbulent years in American history? What are some of the events that took place that caused all that chaos?
Well, I think for Americans often see themselves at the center of the world. A lot of the cultural and social upheaval going on in this country was also going around the world. Not just the Vietnam War, the Cultural Revolution in China, apartheid in South Africa, student movements across Europe, in London and Paris and Berlin. It was just one of those years that's sort of shorthand for revolution. It's right up there with 1789. It's right up there with 1848. It's right up there with the upheaval of the 1920s and 30s. It's just a year that becomes a shorthand for revolution. It seems like each month in the calendar year 1968, you can find some unprecedented historical event that occurs every single month. You start the year with the Tet Offensive, the surprise attack against U.S. and Allied forces in Vietnam, right at a time when the Americans were told the war was going better. So it wasn't clear how such a surprise attack could happen. The North Korean seizure of the USS Pueblo. You had Johnson's near loss in the New Hampshire primary to insurgent Senator Eugene McCarthy. You had the assassinations you mentioned in April and June. In between there in May, the beginning of the Paris peace talks to get us out. A chaotic convention in Chicago for the Democrats. Nixon's comeback win that fall. All the upheaval in the Democratic Party. Just every single month there was something that the month before you couldn't have predicted. And I think that the central characters in this book, I don't know about you, but when I reach for a new political book, usually there's a voice in my head that says something like, what's the author's take? Do they have an agenda? I think this book really tries to focus pretty evenly on the four major characters of that year. So you have outgoing President Lyndon Johnson, who stuns the nation and goes on TV on March 31st and says he's not going to run or accept the nomination of his party. You have his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, who goes on to become the Democratic nominee. You have, as we knew him then, former Vice President Richard Nixon, who will become the Republican nominee that year, and former and future Alabama Governor George Wallace. And so really rich tapestry here of political heavyweights, I think adds yet another dimension to the year.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's just so many, you used a great word, unprecedented factors that come into play here. And Johnson not rerunning was a bombshell on the nation. Everyone thought he was kind of a shoo-in to get reelected, and the strain and the stress of the job was weighing on him so heavily, it was affecting his health, that he said, I can't really take this anymore. And you mentioned the Paris peace talks. We'll get into that later, but that was kind of his last hope to leave the presidency with a good reputation. But I want to start to get into Nixon now. He was vice president under Eisenhower. He ran for president in 1960 against Kennedy and lost. He ran for the California governorship in 62 and lost again, and was basically brutally humiliated politically. He basically said after he lost the 62 election that this was his last press conference. He's going to leave the political spotlight. But obviously that's not true in hindsight, because he wins the 1968 presidential election. So what was the change between 62 and 68? How did Nixon's mindset and his politics change from when he unsuccessfully ran in 60 to his campaign in 1968?
Well, it's a great question. You set it up nicely. These years for Nixon, the 1960s, are commonly called the wilderness years. And you can imagine, walking out into the wilderness and you get lost and have to find yourself. And you have to spend a lot of time kind of reorienting yourself and kind of gathering yourself and the energy needed to move forward and to get back on track. And I think that's really what Nixon did. Nixon, by Nixon's own admission, he said, during the 8 years I was vice president, I had no time to read anything. I had no time to reflect. Well, in those 6 years in the 60s, that's what he did a lot of. He did a lot of reading, a lot of reflection. That's not easy for him to do, not easy for us or any human to do, to really reflect on your mistakes. And I think he traveled around the world. I think he spent a lot of time learning as much as he already knew about the world. And he came back in 1968 a less visceral, a more patient, more mature version of himself. I think, and also he was a keen political observer. And Republicans went through a fascinating transition in the 1960s from sort of this liberal internationalist, Eisenhower wing of the party still in charge in 60, to Barry Goldwater's nomination in 64, the first time in the post-war era that a true conservative had been nominated by the Republicans. After and for many Goldwater conservatives, there are still a few around today. When you talk to them today, they get kind of a twinkle in their eye and they act like they won in 64, even though it was ultimately a devastating defeat to Johnson. And that's because they finally got a conservative nominated and defeated those darn liberals in the Republican Party. And so Nixon, watched all these kind of currents going on around him, as well as, I think, investing in himself. And when he came back, I would say he was a slightly more kind of populist, maybe a tinge more conservative, not as conservative as Goldwater, but enough to kind of have genuine outreach to people on his right, which he wasn't that concerned about in 1960 or 62. So I think he came back, had a remarkable transformation. It's often called one of the greatest political comebacks in all of American history. And frankly, I can't think of a more prominent one, especially in modern U.S. history.
Yeah, he spent all those years maturing and really came back a different person. He was a lot more mature after studying all these political events that took place. But even in 68, leading up to the election, he was still a little hesitant to run. Why is that?
Well, put yourself through this. You lose one of the closest elections in 1960. Now, I think that's lost a little bit of its luster today for younger Americans because all our elections seem close today. You look since Bush Gore in 2000, it seems like everyone's been close. More than once, the winner of the Electoral College was the loser of the popular vote. And so, this has lost a little bit of its luster to say closest election in 1960. But then in 62, as you pointed out, he was really humiliated by that one. This is a former vice president running for governor. It should have been obvious. He won California in 1960. One of the last times that Republicans could reliably win California in a nationwide contest. And he was humiliated. And he's from California. He moves to New York City to practice law. If that's not a signal that he really thought his political career was over. If you're a conservative Republican, there are better places to move and to reestablish yourself politically than Manhattan, where he wasn't even welcome at sort of Nelson Rockefeller or Jacob Javits, New York City Republican events. As the most recent vice president, he wasn't welcome. So I think that kind of proves that Nixon really thought it was over. This wasn't just a game he was playing. He wasn't really out of it. I think he really thought that was his political obituary, as ABC News called it at the end of 1962. So, he was hesitant for all those reasons, what it would put his family through, his wife Pat Nixon, whose two daughters were still relatively young. And he went down to your state, to Key Biscayne, Florida, in late 67, knowing that he was up against a decision because the New Hampshire primary filing deadline was coming up, or you had to have your fee, your application, your signatures, and so forth to be on the ballot. And I think he was really didn't know what to do. And so he called his friend, the Reverend Billy Graham, and said, come on down to Florida. Graham was from Charlotte, North Carolina, and said, I need your help. Graham says, I'd love to help you, but I can't. I'm really ill. Graham had canceled his whole schedule. He had viral pneumonia, staying at a Holiday Inn outside of Atlanta, Georgia. And Nixon says, but I really need you right now. And so Graham said, no can do. I'm not well enough to travel. Nixon said, I will send a private plane to retrieve you. And Graham wrote in his diary, this is the first book to use the Billy Graham diaries. The Grahams graciously allowed me permission to quote from it in the book. Graham said, well, I guess there are more important things than health. And they walked on the beach on Key Biscayne, on the Atlantic side there, down to the lighthouse, a beautiful state park that's there, still there today, where you can walk down to the same lighthouse. And when Graham had left a couple days later, I think Nixon had basically made up his mind that he was going to do it. And Nixon ultimately credited Graham with being decisive in the decision, about a week later when he cabled him. And Nixon's daughter Julie wrote a book called Special People, and later in the 1970s. And one chapter is dedicated to the Grahams. And she also said that Billy Graham's help in helping her father to know whether to run was also the same word she used, decisive. So I think that's how he finally made the decision.
Yeah, absolutely. Billy Graham was definitely kind of the straw that broke the camel's back and ultimately made him decide to run. But that's an interesting character who I want to kind of get into next just a little bit, is Billy Graham. He was actually a close friend to Nixon and Johnson. So he towed kind of both lines and tried to be as non-biased as possible, never come out publicly in favor of one. So what was kind of his role as friend to Johnson and Nixon? How did he balance that?
No, it's a great question. And these days, I think it's harder to take ourselves back to that time period and understand kind of the different political norms. Back then you had a lot of conservatives in both parties. Today, you just wouldn't think that, observing politics. And so Graham, I would describe Graham as really kind of a moderate conservative. Think about him not kind of a conservative from the Deep South, but really from the fringes. I mean, Charlotte, North Carolina was kind of the fringe. And he was moderate. He was pro-civil rights. He considered himself to be a lifelong Democrat, although that didn't mean that's how he always voted, he would say. I don't know how he voted. I would guess he probably was split ticket. He probably started going Republican, I would guess, with Eisenhower. Probably Nixon in 60, went back to LBJ maybe in 64, and then I would guess, like a lot of Reagan Democrats, beginning in 72 or 80, probably Republican all the way, but we don't know. That was a private matter for him. He had his crusades often in the South in segregated venues, beginning, I think it was Chattanooga in 1953, and Graham always ignored the rules regarding segregation. He never permitted his audience to be segregated, or any choirs or bands, musicians that appeared on the dais. So you can tell he was really, and he advised Eisenhower about civil rights during the 50s, especially after Little Rock in 1957. So Graham was really kind of a wild card in many ways. He really voted the personality and not the party. He was not a straight line voter. And he was really, I think, symbolic of millions of Americans who were moderates in the 60s. It's fascinating for me to think the same millions who put Johnson over the top in 64 helped Nixon get elected in 68, then put Nixon over the top in a landslide in 72. I'm not sure what they did in 76. They probably, some went Ford and some went Carter, since he was from Georgia. But then I would guess millions of them became Reagan Democrats, even though they considered themselves to be Democrats culturally. For example, organized labor, blue collar, kind of working class voters, probably a lot like my own family where I grew up. They consider themselves Democrats, even though they might have voted Republican. So I think Graham kind of represents this big political shift that's just about ready to happen, in addition to the specific role that he has in 1968.
Yeah, he kind of represents the silent majority of Americans who are just moderate, like you said, blue-collar workers who just want to see a good man in office. They don't get involved with the politics of it all. But there's a few other, particularly two other characters that we haven't really touched on in this story. And there's a couple similarities. There's a lot of similarities that I see between the 68 election and today. One of them being is there's a strong independent movement. We see that today with Robert Kennedy Jr., the son of RFK, and that was George Wallace, and he was running as an independent, and he actually got quite a good following. He made the race pretty competitive. I believe at one point he had like 21% of the vote or something in the polls. But I just want to get into how his campaign affected the election and his controversial pick as World War II Air Force General Curtis LeMay as his vice president, which I find crazy because it turned out to be quite a disaster for his campaign because he had a lot of unprecedented tactics when it came to campaigning, and he said a lot of things that ended up biting them in the butt. So kind of just walk me through their campaign and what it represented and how it impacted the election.
Yeah, so we have all kinds of really interesting characters, in that year. In some ways, I think, George Wallace is the most fascinating because while he didn't win and didn't come close to winning, I think he really started a movement, a political movement, a sort of populist movement that you can say has largely been part of the playbook of every winner since, especially more recently on the Republican side of the aisle with Donald Trump. So Wallace is tough to describe. I thought a lot about Wallace. So many books just say racist, and they leave it at that. I think it's much more interesting to actually try to figure him out, to the extent that you can. There's no question that he did say some things in 1962 and 1963 that even he later admitted that he apologized for, and he sought amends for later in his life. When 62, he said if elected governor, he would stand in the schoolhouse door of the University of Alabama to block integration. In 63, at his inaugural address, he declared segregation today, tomorrow, and forever. But you see by 64, not that long after, he's beginning to walk back from that. And while he never repudiated those earlier statements, what I conclude in the book was that he had his first taste of national politics. And he had to establish a message that was going to work not just beyond Alabama, but beyond the South. And so by 64, he enters 3 Democratic primaries, and he does better than expected. And by 68, he runs his really first full-bore 50-state campaign. He runs, as you said, as an independent because he wanted to be able to criticize both national parties. And this is something that Americans, we don't see very often. I mean, I don't know about you, but, usually when I look at the ballot, you see kind of the recognizable parties at the very top, and then I kind of scan my eye down, at least for a minute, lower on the ballot, and there's a bunch of names, in some cases, I've never heard of, or political parties. I'm almost a little ashamed of that, but some of them are pretty small movements. And Wallace chose the American Independent Party. It was an established party, but I would say today we have to look back, maybe Ross Perot, 92, 96, to find a time when an independent candidate actually made a real difference. Perot was higher in the polls. I think was maybe as high as 39% or so at one point, but he did not win any electoral college votes, which of course what really makes a difference in the outcome. Wallace polled as high as you said, 20-some, 21, 23% maybe. He did win about 10 million votes in the popular vote and some electoral college votes. And more important, I would say also, just as important, he got on the ballot in all 50 states. So imagine what the Wallace people told me who I talked to was he hired up all these brand new law school graduates. They got a big map of the country. They each split up, you take these states, I'll take these states. But imagine this, you have to navigate 50 sets of state laws for how to get on that ballot, as an independent. And that takes a certain amount of money, a certain number of signatures. And I tell you, while it seems like both of the major parties don't agree on very much, they agree on one thing for certain, keeping third-party challenges out of their state. And so you've got some like California, where you not only have to collect the signatures, but you have to have everyone signing complete a 2-page application to join this new political party. So these hurdles are all created to make it difficult for third-party challengers. Ohio's went all the way to the state Supreme Court. He did not get on the ballot in the District of Columbia, but that was fairly inconsequential compared to the rest of the state. But he got on the ballot in all 50 states. And as you say, his running mate that year, General Curtis LeMay, was an interesting choice. As far as I know, LeMay did not know Wallace beforehand. LeMay probably was a Republican in 68, and it actually, one letter I found said he planned to vote for Richard Nixon. LeMay, he's often criticized in American history as being a warmonger, largely because of his role in the World War II firebombing of the Japanese coastline, which killed maybe 100,000 people. But actually, during the Cold War, he probably did more to keep the country out of war, than in war, in terms of being in charge of Strategic Air Command of the Air Force. He was really kind of the person who managed our atomic arsenal and making sure we didn't use them carelessly. So I think, he has a distinguished record, a controversial record, and in '68, somehow Wallace convinced him to come out of retirement. And I think LeMay was sort of an old-fashioned public service, that if he was convinced he had a duty to do for the country, I don't think he wanted to be a politician. I don't think he needed to be a politician. He had heart trouble. He had heart trouble already by the late '60s. But I think Wallace somehow convinced him that it was his duty, that he had one more act of public service left in him. And I do think that Wallace, remember, Humphrey and Nixon were both campaigning to end the war on their own terms. And Wallace and LeMay were really the only ones who are toying with the idea of military victory still. Turning over control not to the politicians, but to the commanders on the ground in Vietnam, and let them figure out how to win it. And I think that was refreshing to an old military man, an old soldier like LeMay, and that was probably surely part of the appeal as well.
Yeah, I can see why that would be appealing for LeMay, but you're right. There absolutely was a lot of hurdles, and I think it was a pretty great achievement for an independent party, an independent candidate, to land all 50 states on the ballot. But there's one more character who is a force in this race, and that was Hubert Humphrey, who was the vice president at the time under Lyndon B. Johnson. And reading your book, I kind of got the impression that his story here is kind of sad, a little desperate. Johnson didn't really like Humphrey, it seemed. He wasn't supporting his campaign openly, which is kind of crazy if you look at that today. It would seem that if a vice president under a president was running, I mean, you kind of look how Obama supported Biden when he was running. It just seems a little crazy looking back that Johnson was just not going to support his campaign openly, and in the end actually preferred Nixon over Humphrey, which is just mind-blowing to me that a sitting Democratic president would support the Republican nominee. But just walk me through Humphrey's campaign and his decision to run for president after being vice president, and how he kind of felt silenced and censored under Johnson, and how he kind of wanted to break free, and how he had a lot of trouble breaking away from Johnson's policies to kind of create his own image and his own legacy, but not trashing the administration he was just a part of.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And whole books there have been, I think, 2 or 3 recent biographies of Hubert Humphrey. So this remains a topic of fascination for people. Well, I think the way that I would start is by saying that, the job of vice president remains today one of the most awkward in the city of Washington. I think it's gotten better. Walter Mondale told me that by '76, he was able to negotiate kind of almost like a memorandum of an understanding with Jimmy Carter. That if you can kind of carve out your role and negotiate specific duties based on your own interests and passions. I think it's gotten a little better, but I mean, constitutionally, it's about as thin as any officer of this nation in terms of, you open and gavel in the opening session of the Senate, and then, as they say, you are a heartbeat away from the presidency. I mean, you're in line to succeed, but that doesn't mean you share any of the responsibility. To the extent you have any real authority is only because the president shares it with you. And, I think that's the first point. The second point I would say is that Johnson was simply not the kind of person to share the presidency with anybody. I don't think it was personal for Humphrey. I think Humphrey was a very good person, maybe even too good for politics, and I think very loyal to Johnson. And even when Humphrey didn't feel that loyalty was returned, Humphrey knew in his gut that the only reason he's gotten that far in politics was because of Lyndon Johnson. So he simply couldn't betray him or campaign against him. The third point I would say, I spend a lot of time around 18, 19, 20-year-olds in the classroom, and I teach a lot of political history. I would say if you look at any election and one of the candidates is the vice president of the outgoing president or someone very, very close to them, that's the campaign to watch because they have the hardest task. I mean, put yourself in their shoes. So you have all the proposals and promises that every campaign has running. And, the first cynic in the press says, if you've got all these good ideas, then why didn't you do them the last 4 years or 8 years? So you have to both stand on the record of the last 4 or 8 years and yet awkwardly somehow argue that you have more ideas, which are even better, but there's some reason why you didn't already do them, if you thought about them now. And you also need to understand that outgoing presidents are strengths in some part of the country and weaknesses in others. And so how do you do all these things and win the enthusiastic endorsement of your president where you want it and get them to stay away, where you don't want it? It's extremely awkward, and there's no good answer. And Nixon had to do this in '60 with Eisenhower. More recently, Gore had to do it with Clinton in 2000. Hillary Clinton a little bit in 2016. Of course, she wasn't vice president, but she was Secretary of State and was very high-ranking and close to the administration. And I think often, if politics makes for strange bedfellows, as is often said, I think that's especially true when it comes to political legacies. Political fights are the most vicious when they're within the same family. You expect opposite political parties to attack each other. But when it comes to your own legacy, I think it's more common than not that a president of one party prefers to be succeeded by someone of the other party. And that seems like a very radical idea. But if you're succeeded by someone else of the other party, you will be attacked. And that will force your own party to come to your defense. If you're succeeded by someone in your own party, frequently all those good ideas they have mean you're going to be forgotten. And so it's almost better. One White House attorney once told me, people don't realize that an awful lot happens in this town for personal, selfish reasons. And as strange as this would sound, I would not be surprised one day, maybe 50 years from now, since it's taken this long to make sense of 1968, that actually Obama in some way might have preferred to be succeeded by Trump, because it would have forced his own party to come to his defense. The Clintons and Obamas have never liked each other, as far as we know, and we'll probably learn more about that one day. So as awkward as that sounds, when it comes to personal, selfish legacies, it begins to make a little more sense. And so the most controversial argument, which you alluded to in this book, is that Johnson ultimately preferred Nixon as his own successor. And the evidence that I cite in the book is back to Billy Graham. Billy Graham was a messenger between the two of them. And a number of those messages he recorded or captured or wrote down in his own diary, which I cited in the book. And it's clear there's a pattern of messages that goes back and forth between, say, June and the fall of '68. And they lead me to believe that Johnson probably preferred Nixon for two reasons. One, Democrats in '68 were promising to end Lyndon Johnson's war, as Vietnam was known, and blame him. And therefore, he would be the first president to lose a war in U.S. history. That was something Johnson desperately did not want to happen. Nixon wasn't saying anything like that. He was saying he'd wind down the war, but not in a way that would ever embarrass Johnson. And secondly, Nixon, by about May of '68, was giving pretty left-wing speeches on domestic policy. He wasn't saying he was going to overturn Johnson's Great Society any more than Eisenhower overturned FDR's New Deal, as many conservatives wanted back then. What Nixon proposed instead was sort of shading in a more Republican way a lot of Johnson's big spending programs. So instead of big welfare bills, it was tax cuts for a black middle class, or business credits, or community policing, or investments, private investment for businesses in urban areas. So it's kind of the same amount of money being spent, but just kind of shading it slightly differently in a more conservative, friendly, free market way. And so I think gradually throughout the year, I don't know that Johnson liked Nixon or supported his campaign, but given the two choices he had when it came to his own personal legacy, I do think he ultimately concluded that Nixon was better for his own legacy.
Wow, that is such an interesting point to me. Humphrey definitely had a very difficult job, but that's something I've never thought of, is a president would almost want the opposing party to succeed them for their own legacy because their party would back them. And I think it's a great point because especially when it came to Johnson, he was known for having a very large ego. He really cared about his legacy as president. And you're right. If Humphrey was elected, then Johnson would be seen as the president who lost the war. And Humphrey was probably seen as more critical of Johnson's administration than Nixon was. So that's a fascinating point that I've never thought of.
Well, and I'll make an even more radical one right now for 2024. That it would not surprise me, despite his public sayings to the contrary, including his speech the other day in Valley Forge, that it's better for President Biden's own legacy if he's going to lose, if he's not going to run again, perhaps to be succeeded by Trump. Because that will force Democrats who are not inclined to defend Biden to defend him. If he's succeeded by someone kind of on his left in the Democratic Party, he's going to be flushed down the tubes. I mean, he will be forgotten by history and forgotten by the Democratic Party. So it's, believe me, when it comes to legacies, it's a very strange kind of twisted world. But you know, and none of us knows sort of what's on the heart or in the mind of another person. But it's sometimes the issue goes deeper than what a politician is saying publicly in front of a microphone when it comes to legacies.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's something I've never thought of, and that's such an interesting point. But when it comes to Biden, I can't see him continuing another 4 years in kind of the state that he's in.
Well, I would say not controversial. I would say it's historical. And I would say, actually, you know, during Biden's own lifetime, he's probably aware of the fact that Harry Truman had to make the same decision in 1952 and that Lyndon Johnson had to make it in 1968, which is the even closer parallel. And in both cases, I would say March is the month to watch. And people say, oh, he could never wait that long. No, you have to understand it from his perspective, again, which is what I'm trying to tap into here. The moment you decide you're not going to run, you're a lame duck. You will get nothing else accomplished. Congress will not listen to you. Your own party will not listen to you. Your top people will all quit and turn to one of the challengers. The spotlight of the media will be on everyone but you the remainder of the years. So it is in your personal selfish interest to wait as long as possible. Johnson did March 31st. Harry Truman, I think, did March 29th, right after kind of New Hampshire. I think this is the window between now and then to watch. And like Truman and Johnson, the lesson here is that they changed their minds and decided not to run. They had to make up a reason. In Truman's case, it was, you know, he was old. In Johnson, I think it was his health. He couldn't unite the country. I would not be surprised if Biden is aware of these and is even having people figure out how did they decide these, the timing, the format, televised, radio, and have those notes ready so he can really think about this. The moment he begins to doubt his own reelection, that was the inflection point, I think, for Truman and Johnson. And I don't know who is giving that kind of advice to Biden today other than the First Lady, but that is the key thing to pay attention to.
I think there's a lot of ramblings, even within the Democratic Party, to kind of find a substitute. I don't think even the Democratic Party wants Biden to rerun. And I think they should look back at history, like you said, that when looking to rerun, when you're not really in a state to still be in office, that it ultimately works out better for your legacy to step aside and let someone else either step in your place from your own party or let the other party succeed you. So that's a very interesting point you make. March is the month to watch for.
The humiliation of not running is better than the worst humiliation of running and losing.
But back to 1968, so we have Nixon as the Republican candidate and Humphrey as the Democratic candidate. And the Democratic National Convention takes place first, and it is in Chicago, and it is an absolute disaster from what I got from your book. There's riots, people are kind of trying to disrupt it and cause as much chaos as possible, and it is just not a good look for the Humphrey campaign. So what happened at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago?
Well, in Chicago, Chicago was chosen by Lyndon Johnson as a site of the convention at a time when it was assumed Johnson would be coronated again as the party's nominee. In fact, the day of the convention that was chosen to select the presidential nominee was Johnson's birthday, August 27th, which is his 60th birthday, which is the same thing Johnson did in 1964 at the convention in Atlantic City. The day that he was chosen as the nominee was his actual birthday. Johnson had it late in the year because he didn't want to run a long campaign. He didn't think he needed to as the incumbent president. His friend, Chicago Mayor Richard Daley, was going to keep control of things and make sure Johnson got his way. Well, as soon as Johnson wasn't running anymore, all bets were off. about 6 months or so before the convention, a number of kind of countercultural movements were planning to move into Chicago, set up a presence there, and just cause disruption. I don't think they really had a plan. I see no evidence that they preferred another candidate. They just wanted to be disruptive. And it's going to be interesting this year that in addition, you mentioned Robert Kennedy Jr. as another parallel between 68 and today. The Democrats are going back to Chicago this year. And while I can't imagine it would be as chaotic as in 1968, I'm assuming it's going to be pretty lively, for all of the reasons that we've already been discussing. But it was just a disaster. And I think what made it the worst of all for in 68 was that many Americans, millions of Americans, could see the chaos, the riots in the street in which the Chicago police took part, the countercultural movement and the protest and the filth on their televisions, from their living rooms. And I think many Americans fairly, or I want to be fair, or unfairly, began to blame the chaos of the 1960s, the violence on TV, the Vietnam War. All these things happened under Democrats. That's probably not fair to say. But Republicans have been out of office since January of 61. And so I do think there was a substantial minority of Americans who probably did either, who normally voted Democrat, who either didn't vote at all that year or voted for another candidate, or might even have voted for Richard Nixon. And so I think on TV, it was kind of a capsule of the whole decade that things had just gotten way out of hand. And I think if there's one thing that both parties agreed on in 1968 is we need to turn the noise level down here. And I think that's partly why Johnson was drawn to Nixon as someone whose political career predated the chaos. He wasn't tied to the war. He wasn't tied to riots or his career rise had took place in the 1950s before all that had happened. So I think choosing Nixon in a way was a bit like time travel. It's a way of kind of rewinding the clock to a calmer era, to someone who wasn't tied and therefore didn't have a position to defend on either the war or the chaos at home. And I think for that reason, Nixon got a lot of votes from people who weren't necessarily enthusiastic about Richard Nixon, but saw him as a way of ending the chaos.
The Democratic National Convention was a horrible stain on the Humphrey campaign. In the last decade of Democratic presidents and the chaos you see throughout the 60s just really set up kind of a perfect storm for the Humphrey campaign to fail. And I believe his poll numbers reached rock bottom after the convention, correct?
Yeah, he was down to, after the convention, around 28, 29%, with Wallace at about 23, right there nipping at his heels. So he was about a 15-point deficit. Nixon was kind of low to mid-40s at that point.
Yeah, and at this time, Nixon's kind of way out front, definitely the favorite, but the Republican National Convention takes place in Miami Beach, and it seems that all went smooth there.
I would say more smoothly. I think conventions are always targets of disruption, but as you know, Miami Beach is a place that, you can secure a few causeways and shut off, so you can seal off the whole area. Chicago, with the Hilton and the layout there of the convention, it was a major city. You couldn't block every street in a major city. Miami Beach was easier to control. Hubert Humphrey wanted the convention moved to Miami Beach, but Johnson said no, because he didn't want to show disrespect for his friend Richard Daley, mayor of Chicago. So I think Miami Beach was far more orderly, not without a little bit of chaos. Nixon had made his comeback. Very strong challengers. George Romney, governor of Michigan, was someone who really looked like a president but faded early. California Governor Ronald Reagan, endorsing Barry Goldwater in 64, becoming a Republican after becoming, he was previously a prominent Democrat labor leader. 66 gets elected to the California governorship, the position that Nixon could not do just 4 years before. And Reagan, of course, is considerably to his right, so you would think would have a smaller share of the votes. And so Reagan was surging. You also had a liberal Republican New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller. These were all kind of also-rans who were photogenic. They had money. These are people who looked like presidents. These weren't just minor candidates. And they all fizzled out for various reasons, kind of leaving Nixon as the last man standing.
Yeah, you're right. There was absolutely a lot of strong candidates running against Nixon. And obviously Reagan being the most notable, he ends up kind of taking over the Republican Party's reins after Nixon, falls back, as we'll get into, tremendously after Watergate. But I really want to get into the Vietnam War here because I think it was probably the biggest issue at hand during the 1968 election, and it had the most influence in shaping how the election took place. But we talked a little bit earlier about the peace talks with North Vietnam in Paris, and that was kind of Johnson's last effort to attain peace and leave the president with a good legacy. So what were the peace talks in Paris? Who was involved? How were they going?
Yeah, I mean, the war actually up until just before the 68 election had been a strength for Johnson. It was a political asset because it really rallied millions of patriotic Americans who believed in their president, who were against communism, and who believed that American fighting soldiers were doing the right thing for our ally, South Vietnam, in terms of keeping them, really pushing back the invasion from North Vietnam, as it was seen at the time. Really, that begins to change in late 1966. At the midterms, Johnson loses a ton of seats in the House and Senate, really everything he gained 2 years before over Goldwater, and Republicans are beginning to claw back territory by 66. And so the war really goes, Johnson begins increasingly criticized by his own party. Because of that, in 67, congressional hearings, prominent cabinet members like Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, decide he can no longer support the war policy, which, by the way, was his war policy at that point. And so Johnson, the back of Johnson's memoirs lists in its final pages the dozens of bombing halts and peace overtures that he tried in those years. And so Johnson, while continuing, kind of begins a two-tier strategy, continuing to fight the war, but behind the scenes also beginning to try to negotiate a way out of that same war. And so he has one last attempt, beginning in mid-May of 1968. So Johnson, skeptical of things like bombing halts as a sign of peace. After all, American bombing of North Vietnam was one of the only real tools of leverage that the Americans had against the North Vietnam. We weren't going to do a land invasion, a ground invasion of North Vietnam. We didn't understand the terrain and the jungles and the rice paddies the way they did because we weren't from there. So bombing from the skies, control of the skies, was really the one factor that Americans had. And so by having a bombing halt, you're giving up the one tool and that you really had. So Johnson was skeptical. But I think people around Johnson always said he really wanted to be known as a peacemaker. He was more secure on the domestic side of his legacy. He felt good there with Civil Rights, Higher Ed Act, Civil Rights of 64, Voting Rights Act of 65, his whole domestic legislation he felt pretty good about. The war he knew was the weak part of his legacy. He desperately wanted to be known as a peacemaker, and I think even though he doubted whether the peace talks could produce much, he authorized their beginning in mid-May in Paris at a neutral site where the United States met representatives of North Vietnam, the communists in Hanoi, our enemies with whom we had no diplomatic relations at the time. Later, Saigon, our allies, the capital of South Vietnam, joined those negotiations because, of course, this was the Vietnam War after all. I mean, both sides had to approve of the outcome. They were the ones who had to live with whatever peace agreement that we would negotiate. So from mid-May until the election, those peace talks went on. I find Johnson to be consistently skeptical, but thinking, what harm would it be? This might be my last chance. And people could criticize me. You could have tried one more time. You could have stopped the bombing one more time. You could have tried one more peace offer to our enemies. Even if it was going to fail, what did you have to lose? And I think that logic underlying was what drove Johnson's decision, not any real hope to have peace or certainly to end the war, in his remaining months in office.
Yeah, you brought in an important aspect of the negotiations with Vietnam, and that was the bombing halt. The bombing halt seemed to be the hot topic with each of the campaigns and with the negotiations, because you're right, that was kind of the only chips that the U.S. had in their corner. That was the only piece of leverage they had. But the peace talks drag on through the election, and they ultimately don't really achieve anything, correct?
Yeah, the only thing they achieved in 68, and of course they go on in different forms until 73, when finally we withdraw all of our troops, we get all of our POWs back, and then by the spring of 73, we're all out, and Saigon falls to the communists 2 years later in the spring of 75. But in 68, the only thing we really negotiate by election time were the term, really it was sort of talking to make sure we could agree to keep talking. And so we agreed to keep talking, to have more serious talks, which begin under Nixon. More serious meaning Saigon finally joins. The National Liberation Front, the kind of insurgents in the South, also join unofficially as a party of the talks. So we negotiate an expanded bombing halt, which was announced by Johnson on October 31st, 1968, on the eve of the election. We negotiate the addition of Saigon at the talks, as well as the NLF, which doesn't really get going until Nixon starts his own version of the talks in early 69. So I would say there's a few achievements, but they fell quite a bit short of what Johnson and those around Johnson hoped.
Yeah, to me, the most fascinating aspect of this entire peace talks, Vietnam War situation in the election is something called the Chenault Affair that you had a whole chapter about. And it was basically about a girl named Anna Chenault. She was a Republican fundraiser. She was Chinese born, had a lot of foreign economic interests because she had shipping contracts, and basically she had incentive to keep the war going. And there's a lot of speculation and accusation that Nixon went behind the president's back to talk to South Vietnam and said, withhold from the peace talks, I'll give you a better deal when I'm president. And that would be treason, ultimately. And Johnson knew about this whole Chenault affair, but kind of kept it secret. So what exactly was the Chenault affair? Is it true? Because in your book, you say that Nixon didn't really have anything to do with it. He was kind of not oblivious, but he wasn't necessarily involved in the conflict. So basically, are the accusations true that Nixon went behind the president's back and told South Vietnam to withhold from the peace talks so he could give them a better deal?
Well, I would say my short answer is that, first of all, there's a lot of records about this that are still not released by the government. She had ties to the CIA, Anna Chenault did, and those records are not released. I think my bottom line answer right now is based on the available evidence today. Historians can no more prove a negative, that he didn't do it, than an attorney can in a courtroom. I would say, at least so far, the evidence that's there doesn't really add up to much of anything. It's very murky. And the opening line of this book begins with that treason line, that Johnson to Everett Dirksen phone call. There is a chapter about Anna Chenault. There's also a whole appendix in the book that goes through some of Bob Haldeman's notes, Nixon's assistant during the campaign, who becomes his chief of staff during the presidency. And those notes have been used prominently in late 2016 and early 2017 by some as evidence of how Nixon committed treason. And what I speculate in the book is that, first of all, this story has been on the public record since January of 1969. It's been around a long time. It's silent for a few years, and it comes back. Sort of the drip, drip, drip of another document comes out. We take a fresh look. But I argue, during Watergate, if there was much to this at all, during Watergate, when seemingly every aspect of Richard Nixon's political career was investigated, I used to always say he's the most investigated politician in U.S. history. Now, it might be one day we say that becomes Donald Trump, or maybe the Clintons during that impeachment. I don't know. Maybe the Clintons actually were more. But during Watergate, when we could have called all of the witnesses who knew about the Chenault affair, I think if there was anything to that, that would have happened. If we're talking about possibly illegal campaign contributions of milk producers in 1972, and what you're talking about is that Nixon might have reached the presidency itself by dishonorable means, I think we would have investigated that. And so it's just this mysterious thing, and she is mysterious. She's very mysterious. I would call her kind of a Southern Democrat. She's Chinese born. A lot of books have been written calling her a Nixon insider or a Republican heavyweight. I don't really see that at all. Her husband, famous General Claire Chennault during World War II, was from Louisiana. He was a Southern Democrat in a one-party state, and there basically was no Republican Party. So the extent that she had any political views at all, I would say she was a very strong anti-communist. She was a kind of conservative Southern Democrat. The only political issue I ever heard her write about, going through her papers, which are up at Harvard, was communism and the war. She was very much a strong supporter of Lyndon Johnson when he was strong on the war. And once he began to look a little shaky, 67, especially 68, I think that's when she sort of shopped around for a better candidate. And she did not like Nixon campaigning that he was going to get out of Vietnam. She really didn't like that Nixon wanted to make peace with the Chinese or the Soviets. So she had a great falling out with Nixon, actually. She was certainly not an insider of Nixon's. Like Johnson choosing the lesser of two evils for his own legacy, I think Chenault was choosing the lesser of the available evils in 1968. And so I think when you go through all the evidence, it's interesting, it's murky, it's also incomplete, and there's more about this that we have to learn. You would think by now we know it all, but that's not true. Some intelligence records take 75 years plus to come out, believe it or not. So I think this is not the last thing written about this. We're going to be learning more about it in the future. But I think if you really go through the evidence, it doesn't prove much of anything.
Yeah, that's what's so awesome about your book, especially in that chapter, is you cite so much evidence and so many quotations from the memoirs that you really get a good sense of all sides of the story. I find her kind of a comedic character because she kind of prances around with a false sense of significance. She likes these honorary titles that no one really cares about. And I think that's why some of those authors kind of call her a Republican heavyweight, because in her memoirs, she makes it sound like she is. She makes it sound like she had a lot of influence and she was getting a lot of things done, but in reality, no one really cared what she was doing or who she was. Nixon rarely ever talked to her, kind of like ignored her. She couldn't get a hold of him when she tried to reach him. So I guess you're right. When looking at the evidence, maybe that'll change when the evidence comes out that you were talking about that's still confidential.
I think I would say, she was in many ways ahead of her time. After she died a few years ago, I wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and I wrote, imagine this. I mean, she was a woman operating in a very much a man's world at that time. I mean, we're talking about international business and finance and shipping during a war, political heavyweights. I would say something else in common with everyone who's written about her in recent years is no one actually interviewed her when she was alive. I did. I went to her Watergate penthouse, and I talked to her about the things that we're talking about now. And it was shocking to me, how little she really knew about the things that she supposedly did. And so I think when you add it all up, this is not a case where I can say I'm 100% certain that it didn't happen. But I certainly, have more confidence that it didn't than it did, at this point.
Yeah, that's absolutely, to take nothing away from her. She involved in international business, involved in political campaigns. That's very unprecedented for females at that time. I would also like to emphasize that this by no means takes away from the sympathy that we feel for the soldiers of the Vietnam War. I mean, it was just an absolute brutal, devastating war that changed a whole generation. You know what I mean? The 60s, the generation that came out of the 60s really was completely different just because of the Vietnam War, whether that was you're an anti-war protester or, you were there. And I think that was a phenomenal answer.
I've traveled to Vietnam a number of times in recent years for research and other books, including research in their archives. And Vietnam today is an amazing place to travel to. You can see all of the American infrastructure built, buildings, schools, hospitals, bridges, roads, railroad networks, coastal areas, former bases that are now used for other purposes. Vietnam today is probably one of the most pro-American places that you can possibly visit on this entire globe. And to throw out a controversial question, I don't know the answer to, and this kind of dissonance doesn't really bother me. Would this pro-American view would it exist if not for the Vietnam War? The fact that our former enemies have now become our friends? I don't know. And so there's lots of ways to look at traumas and history, and sometimes it takes a very long time to have a good perspective to judge those.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'm glad in hindsight we can look back and see that the Vietnam turned out to be a wonderful place and we're allies now, and everything kind of worked out per se. But back to the election, we're coming off the peace talks. We got Nixon and Humphrey. Now, after the Democratic Convention, like we were talking about, Nixon was really ahead because of all the chaos at the Democratic Convention, but Humphrey kind of changed his campaign strategy towards the end and actually started to pull in a lot of voters. He started to appeal to the working class and how he was going to help them out, and that kind of brought him close. So it was actually a pretty tight race. So in the end, what were the results of the 1968 election?
It was a tight race. And here's another case where so many books have been written to say that Humphrey made it close because he turned on Lyndon Johnson on the Vietnam War. He finally declared his independence. And here's another case where I interviewed Humphrey's strategist during the campaign, Vic Fingerhut, who no one ever talked to. And he said it's absolutely wrong. He said, I'm the one that wrote the memo to Humphrey. He was working on his first campaign that year in '68. He's still around advising candidates today, usually kind of Democrats, pro-labor, not just in the U.S., but also in Britain, Australia. And he said, I wrote Humphrey, I said, you need to immediately change your strategy to focus on traditional democratic issues. That even if you don't have favorable policies to discuss now, refer voters to what Democrats have done for them historically. Education, Social Security, the economy, jobs, and so forth. And so he flips the strategy to domestic policy, more or less, and he makes it close because those are not strong issues for Republicans typically. And so it used to be said this was one of the closest elections in history. See my previous disclaimer, since they're all close now. The popular vote was about 500,000 votes difference that Nixon won. The Electoral College was more decisive, especially when you consider, when you add Nixon's total plus Wallace's being kind of a rejection of everything of that decade, especially the Democrats of that decade, it becomes a little more lopsided. You know, I would not call it a landslide, but certainly more decisive. But I think there was another factor at play that's very much like 2024. So many voters on both sides of the aisle seem to be voting against someone or against something rather than for someone or for something. And in '68, this ultimately, I think, left Nixon with a very difficult mandate, because so many of the people who voted for him, or traditional Democrats who didn't vote at all, or might have voted for Wallace, I think the American people were very unsure what they wanted. They knew they didn't want the chaos of the '60s, but I think they weren't very sure what they wanted after that. And so I think that made Nixon's presidency especially turbulent.
Nixon wins the election, and you're right, it kind of would have been a really decisive victory because Wallace, most of his voters actually came from the Democrats and the Humphrey side of the aisle. So if Wallace wasn't such a contender in the race, they probably would have voted for Nixon, and it would have been quite a lopsided victory. But anyway, Nixon wins the election, and him and LBJ were on good terms because Johnson had kind of behind closed doors endorsed Nixon. Obviously, they had a mutual friend in Billy Graham. So how was the transition process to Lyndon B. Johnson to Nixon? Because it was quite a smooth transition process, right?
Yeah, I would be careful. I mean, I'm not afraid in this book to deal with nuance. And, you know, I don't see politics in black and white like a lot of people do. I see sort of the various shades of gray. And I would say that Johnson and Nixon had a mutual non-aggression pact. You know, as long as one did not criticize the other, there would not be return fire. So friendly might be, I would say not friends, but friendly. You know, that if you get my drift. Nixon was invited to the Johnson White House on more than one occasion. The tradition is you invite the victor once for a formal, you know, on-the-record meeting. Nixon had several meetings, long meetings. They even spent time in the family quarters of the White House, which Nixon actually had never seen before, even as 8 years of vice president under Eisenhower. Once Nixon ran his cabinet picks by Johnson, which is really unbelievable. They even had a meeting of Nixon's cabinet-to-be and Johnson's outgoing cabinet. They did a press conference together where Johnson deferred to Nixon, and Nixon did the same thing. Nixon said something like, you know, this administration speaks for this administration as well as for the next administration, for the next couple of months. I would say the closeness in transition especially considering don't forget who these people were. These were the ultimate political rivals of their own generation. The most aggressive partisan Democrat, the most aggressive partisan Republican, each of their own generations in U.S. politics. And I don't think they ever quite came to like each other. I think they were drawn to each other because they realized they needed each other, because their legacies were intertwined. So to answer your question very succinctly, I would say it was probably the most coordinated, close transition, certainly in U.S. history, and maybe also in all of U.S. history in terms of different political parties.
Interesting. So their friendship was kind of for show, behind closed doors. Maybe they didn't necessarily like each other, but they were friendly to each other and made appearances and Nixon visited LBJ's ranch. But that wraps up the story. Nixon is now in office. That completes our story of the 1968 election and all of its chaos. If you guys want to read the entire story, make sure to go check out his book on Amazon. It's a masterpiece, in my opinion. Really insightful about an aspect of American history that I wasn't too familiar with, because there's so much packed in here. But I want to thank you so much for coming on. It was a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it.
My pleasure. Thank you.